Hello, everybody. So glad you could join us. This is the second AU Diversity and Excellence Summit, the day the DEI stood still. I love a good science fiction pun. Who doesn't? And last year's event was really, really cool. We got together a few different organizations to talk about some of the big issues around the changes that were happening, particularly in the US last year, that had some ripple effects across the industry, across the world, certainly the industry in the US, and how that was affecting everything around the globe. Coming back a year later, we're looking at some different case studies of initiatives and organizations who are doing some great work. And I'm really looking forward to talking to them today. And hopefully, you guys can talk to each other and get to know each other and form networks, because this is all about building networks and building communities, because nobody gets good at a skill or as a business or as an industry without community and without people helping each other out. Nobody exists in a vacuum. So I'm Neal Romanek. I am the founder of AU. AU is a publishing company and content creation company. We do a magazine, we do regular events like this, we do a website, all built and aimed towards helping creatives and creative businesses do the best they can in very tricky times. So we look at some of these big impact issues affecting the media industry, AI, change in work, diversity and training, sustainability, the collapse in truth and journalism. A lot of these issues, which we see as big impact issues, which are going to affect not just the industry, but our world at large. So we want to be able to help people navigate that world and to provide really good services for people who need them. Um, we're going to jump right in. This will be there'll be 4 sessions from our guests. If you can hear a squeaking sound, that's not my stomach. That's a very sad dog outside. That's my dog out there going, why can't I join? I should give her a camera and she would be great in the Q&A. But yeah, we're going to do these the 4 sessions, and there will be time for you guys to chat with each other as well in some breakout rooms. And then at the end, we'll have a general free-for-all discussion, which I'll moderate, talk about some of the main themes that we've discussed. And if you do have any thoughts, questions, ideas, comments, you want to promote yourself and what you do, put that in the chat. Don't be shy about putting yourself forward and saying, hey, I've got this idea. I want to, no formalities here, jump right in. So we're going to start out with Lisa Bell. Lisa from Tell Jane. And she's going to tell us a little bit about Tell Jane, and also talk about this issue of DEI, what they used to call DEI 365 days ago, or at least, not too long ago, and how we approach these discussions. We talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion, we talk about trying to give people proper boost and advantages that we all deserve. But how do we talk about it now? Do we have to use different languages? Do we have to be more subtle? Do we have to be smarter about how we communicate these things? I don't know, but Lisa does. So Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Neal, for having me and the introduction. So today I'm really going to talk about that sort of shift in the D&I landscape. And really, I think what I want to speak about today is the conversation around inclusion isn't disappearing, right? It's still present, but the environment around organizations has significantly changed. And I think I want to talk about some of those macro influences, specifically the political, social, and the regulatory pressures that are reshaping expectations across the industry. And I think the crux of that is that leaders are being asked to do more than just make statements about values and what they expect. They're actually being asked to demonstrate action and behavior and role model it. So I'm going to sort of focus my 10 minutes around that. But just a quick intro to me. I'm Lisa. I'm the founder of Tell Jane, and we are a HR and inclusion consultancy of two halves. So half of the business works on complex workplace investigations, anything to do with sexual harassment, bullying, discrimination. The other half of the business really focuses around conversation. How do we stop this stuff from happening in the first place? And the casework that we do helps inform the preventative conversations that we'd like to have with clients. Our clients typically are in the arts more broadly, so TV, theatre, film as well. And we work a bit in sport too. And we work a lot across sort of the big venues around the UK too. So that's a little introduction to me and Tell Jane. I think probably also worth sharing that my sort of background is HR, and that's very much the lens that I'm coming from and sort of framing this conversation today. So I just thought I'd start with some stats, which I found quite interesting. I think first stat that I've got there is more than half of UK employers have changed their approach following sort of political developments in the US when it comes to these diversity and inclusion conversations. I think that a lot of that is driven from the word diversity, I think, has been weaponized a little bit. And I think that I've definitely seen a shift amongst my clients where they're very much having conversations not about D&I anymore, more around inclusion and belonging. And we see that sort of language shift becoming more present across clients. Another stat that I want to draw your attention to is that 40% of UK adults say that they've experienced workplace discrimination. And the final stat there is that 26% of employees say they do not see clear diversity and inclusion policies across their organisations. So if we look at all these stats together, it's signalling something quite important for me. It's telling us the need for inclusion work hasn't gone away, but the way organisations are responding is definitely changing for sure. So here are my thoughts. So if we look at these sort of macro factors that are influencing things, from my perspective, it's definitely sort of the global geopolitical landscape is changing. We've only got to look at sort of the news, and there's so many big issues around on the news that often make diversity and inclusion conversations, I think, feel to some people, particularly if we're talking about inclusive language and belonging, it feels less important when we see what's going on in the outside world. I think that there's more polarization around conversations, and that sort of inclusion conversation has become really, really political when it doesn't really need to be. I think that we have to keep everyone together in organizations, and how do we do that is going to be definitely a big challenge for 2026 and moving into 2027. I think that if we look at how the UK government is dealing that, so that we're moving forward with lots more legislation. So previously we've had the Workers' Protection Act come into play in October, I can't believe it, 2024. It feels like yesterday. And that's sort of really shifting the conversation from less of a reactive duty on employers to a preventative strategy. We've got the Employment Rights Bill coming in too. So the D&I conversation that I'm seeing is very much driven from this legislation at the moment across clients. And I think that there's also a feeling in some organisations that the conversations become quite fatigued at points. I think that there's been lots of conversations sort of post the murder of George Floyd, where there was lots of awareness conversations that were happening in organisations and lots of public statements that were made by clients across lots of different sectors, not just sort of in the media and the creative industries, but how much action has actually materialised off the back of that. So I think now what we're seeing is that evidence is mattering a lot more than intention around things. And I think we've got lots of generations in the workforce more broadly, and the expectation on leadership behaviour. The standards are much higher than what were previously sort of expected. And these are all creating a different response from and a different driver for change in sort of that sort of inclusion landscape. So it's not really about ideology, which I think it previously was. I think it's very much driven from risk management, responsibility, and leadership capability. They're sort of the key points that I'm sort of seeing around my work. So what are the sort of impacts of this? I think that you've got the sort of focus on compliance driven things. So we saw with the Workers Protection Act, there's things like there's the duties on employers to create risk assessments around sexual harassment prevention. That very much feels like a compliance function, not a culture function that would previously sort of be driven from a HR level. There's less conversation sort of focused on awareness, and there's more sort of practical application. So we need new policies around this, we need risk assessments around this, we need to have training delivered for people, and we need to make sure that our training records are up to date, and all that kind of sort of day-to-day things, hygiene factors that are needed around sort of culture. There's definitely an increase in pressure on leadership capability. And we're going to see that even more so with the Employment Rights Act coming in this year, because previously we've had sort of 2 years before somebody was able to sort of raise a complaint or go to tribunal around these things. And now we're going to have 6 months in terms of rights. They were talking about day one rights, now it's 6 months. So I think whereas historically we've had quite a bit of time to get to understand whether someone's right for a role, if it's working, it actually leaders are going to have to be much more proactive on the front foot in how they sort of lead and manage people at the outset of employment. And we're definitely seeing a drive amongst clients around reporting mechanisms. So much more reporting, much more methods to report issues if there are problems. And we're definitely seeing lower level issues coming through. I think if you'd have asked me 2 years ago, the kind of complaints that we were receiving at Tell Jane, they would be much more serious. And when things have really escalated and it almost become unfixable, I see that we're getting much more lower level complaints coming through. And I think that's not a problem, right? Because this is a sign that the system is working in part, because early intervention definitely is a great prevention tool to allow organisations to reset and fix things for people. So how can organisations sort of best prepare for a good culture, an inclusive culture, and for the future is sort of something I've been mulling over. And I think the thing that we're talking to lots and lots of clients about is how can we have respectful conversations with people, set clear boundaries around what inclusive behaviour looks like, and what conduct should look like on a day-to-day basis. And I think the two things we're sort of focused on is making sure that anybody in leadership roles have both a proactive toolkit and a reactive toolkit if there is problems around culture and inclusion. So the reactive, someone comes to you with an issue, something's made them feel uncomfortable at work, be that sort of discrimination, be that sexual harassment, however that may show up. And how do we make sure we get an effective response when these issues are complained? How do we make sure that issues are investigated appropriately if needed, behaviours addressed, and that standards are restored? And then I think the next piece, which is often a bit where people struggle, is that proactive piece. How do we stop these issues from happening in the first place? Making sure that we set behavioural standards early, making sure that there is a shift in team dynamics, that leaders have the skills to notice these changes and have feedback conversations early and prevent issues from escalating into the sort of more serious kind of cases that sometimes we see at Tell Jane. We know that more time spent in the proactive preventative space creates lesser issues in the long term. Right. So I just wanted to end this quick presentation on this sort of quote from Brené Brown, which I think is something I've been talking about a lot at the moment. She wrote the famous book Dare to Lead, but she's actually published another book recently. I'm not sure it's Building Stronger Ground or Stronger Ground, something like that it's called. And this clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And I think that clarity around sort of inclusion standards and what is acceptable and unacceptable conduct is what's needed. I think it's one of the most powerful tools that organizations have. If we look across our client base, lots of different production companies are making sure they've got lots of visuals available when filming up on walls and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and creating those really clear boundaries from the outset. Doing this sort of setting expectations prevents any confusion in the long run. Also, leaders then have a toolkit which say that this is not acceptable, and making sure they give clear and respectful feedback. These standards are what builds trust across organizations. So for me, the future sort of inclusion will be measured less around inclusive language and more around, behavioral standards and leaders being able to have conversations about what that looks like. And that is it for me. And I don't know if anyone's got any questions or thoughts or comments.
Thanks, Lisa. I did have a question that sort of follow up with. There are a couple of things. One was that you're talking about that that the initial impression that some people got from DEI initiatives was that there was kind of like an ideological sort of base for it, or that's kind of the response or the attack maybe that.
Yeah.
But it also feels like, and we were discussing an event of sorts, an encounter before we came on, that sometimes the pushback actually seems really ideological, far more than the actual DEI.
Yeah.
And I just wondered kind of about that, of like kind of being put in the position of like um, having to being sort of pushed to rethink something, and
Yeah.
maybe being kind of pushed off balance from, wait, am I the crazy? Am I the bad guy here? And kind of how you deal with that pushback without giving
Yeah.
ground.
Well, I think if we think about sort of if I sort of reflect on the past sort of 18 months, I think there's lots of words that have been weaponized, but the sort of, I think, woke or wokeness as a term has been weaponized. And I think even the word diversity has been weaponized. And I think this, if you actually look back, I don't know if any of you seen that Kathy Burke sort of clip on when she talks about what woke means. And I think that the very essence of what it means has been misinterpreted. And I think that it sort of swings into left and right wing politics, which is not actually really what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that people can come to work, feel included, not experience microaggressions or just other forms of more serious discrimination or bullying, and making sure that they can be creative and do their best work. And if we swing this into left and right wing politics or wokeness or these, I think it becomes intrinsically unhelpful, and we lose people as part of the conversation. The phrases I hear is, "Oh, you can't say anything nowadays," or "Maybe I'm just a dinosaur," or "I just won't say anything now." And that's not a helpful space to be in. And I think that making these things feel more accessible, and if we have got, some people would object to me, but I think we maybe need to often shift and evolve the language and the conversation to keep people engaged in the process. That would be my tip.
Mm-mm-mm. We can it'd be interesting in the later talk. We can get kind of more into that. There's also a thing that it just sort of fell out this way, but of course, most of I think maybe everybody all the organizations we're talking with here are essentially UK based. I think most of you are based in the UK, or the organization is based in the UK. Um, and that is, we have, like, as you were talking about, some of the legislation and stuff, which is UK centric, but of course the UK is a hub for global production, especially production from the US, but from everywhere. So like everybody's coming through here. And so there's uh and it'll be interesting to hear other people's sort of takes on this, but that how do you operate as an organization within the UK ecosystem? And then also, how are you dealing with the different assumptions and practices that kind of come through the UK?
I mean, outside of the UK, so sometimes we've got some shows that may be being produced in the UK, but then they're going on location in lots of different parts of the world. And it's how do we sort of make sure we still influence sort of conduct, behavior, inclusion in all these spaces while sort of keeping up with the changing legislation in the UK, which is creating more of a demand on different production companies, sometimes with actually quite a small headcount, despite it being a big show that they're producing. That can feel incredibly challenging for people. And I think that keeping things simple, straightforward, clear definitions around this stuff is from the outset, right? Not expecting people to then conform at a later date because there's been complaints. I think that's really, really key for lots of different clients.
Amazing. Great. We will talk more. Thank you so much.